I think we're a go. So
All right.
you're just going to introduce yourself, right?
Well, great. Well, thank you for coming out. I really do appreciate it. I think I've met everybody. I'm Moe Davis. And I just want to what I thought we'd do is just take a little bit. Let me tell you about my background and why I'm running and the positions I'm running on, and then more than happy to answer any questions you've got about me or about policy positions or whatever you want to talk about. So, as I said, I'm Moe Davis. I'm a native North Carolinian. I was born in Shelby, North Carolina. So if you've been down Highway 74 through Shelby, if you've ever seen the Ford dealership, that was my grandfather, Hoyt Keeter, got the dealership from Henry Ford 80 years ago. So the whole family is pretty much based in the Shelby area. Graduated from high school there, Shelby High School. I went to Appalachian State undergraduate. Loved my 4 years up in Boone, although it seems to have changed quite a bit since I was there. I was involved in student government when I was there. I was the director of elections. And back then they wouldn't let us register to vote because the students wanted beer in Boone because you had to go to Blowing Rock to drink. You couldn't drink in Watauga County. So we came up with the idea, if you're my age, you may remember there's a band called Black Oak, Arkansas. And in one of their albums, they had a thing where you got a square inch of Black Oak, Arkansas. So they bought some funeral plots and divided them up into 1-inch squares, and you were a property owner. So we came up with the idea because they objected, saying students weren't connected to the community. And so we came up with the idea of buying a funeral plot and giving everybody a 1-inch square. So eventually the Board of Elections relented, and students got to register to vote in Boone. But after college, I went to law school at North Carolina Central. And when I was growing up, my dad was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II. He grew up on a farm in Rutherford County. If you're familiar with Rutherford County, there's a little town called Newhouse and a little town called Hollis. And he grew up on a farm between the two. He left there as a young man, a healthy young man, went off to World War II and came back 100% disabled. He was at Fort Bragg, and it was during a training exercise when he was in the back of the truck with a bunch of other guys, and the truck flipped over. And everybody was thrown clear except for him, and the truck landed on his back. So when I was growing up, my dad had leg braces and a back brace and hand controls on the car. But he never griped about leaving as a healthy young man and coming back disabled. He was really proud of his military service. In fact, some of my earliest memories are when I was a kid, 55 years ago. I'm 61 now, so probably about 5 or 6 are my earliest memories. But I remember my dad saying, "Hey, you want to go with me? I'm going up to Otine to the VA hospital," which is, you see, I got my cane with me. This weekend I had a whole hip injury that flared up. So I'm going to the same hospital where I used to go with my dad 55 years ago. So after I graduated from law school, I went to summer school at UNC in the summers, and I graduated early and took the February bar exam. And he was tickled to death in April when I got the bar results and I passed. My friends, everybody had told me, this was back in the old days, and now people get emails that tell them whether they passed the bar. Back then you got a real letter, and everybody said if the letter was thick, it was bad news, because it says, "We regret to inform you, and here's the application for the next time." If it's thin, it's good news. It's just saying, "Congratulations, you passed." So inevitably when the letter comes, you end up standing there trying to assess whether it's thick or thin. Unfortunately, mine was thin, and my dad was tickled to death because he never went to college, and for me to get past the bar, be an attorney, was a pretty big deal. And then a week after that, he was in Hendersonville and had a heart attack and died. And that was 1983. And shortly after that, I had applied to the Air Force on a whim. I didn't have any grand desires to serve in the military. Before going to law school, I'd worked for Rufus Edmonston, who was the Attorney General here in North Carolina. I worked in law enforcement training. And so my plan had been, when I graduated, to go back to state government and work there. But then my dad died, and then the Air Force called and said I'd been accepted. I kind of felt like I owed it to him. Plus, for an attorney, it's a good experience. If you join a law firm, you do research for a partner to go to court for a number of years before you finally get your opportunity. We're in the military, you're in court pretty soon out of basic training. In fact, the first trial I ever did was in the spring of 1984. And one of my opponents on the other side was a captain named Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. That was my first trial experience. I wish I could, we could spend an hour. I can't explain to you the change in behavior over the past, particularly the past year.
Yes.
He was a different person back then, but we were all sitting, this was back in 1984, so we were all much younger then, and the trial lasted for a month, and we talked about, during a break, about what we were gonna do when we grew up. And Lindsey said, I'm gonna finish up my time in the Air Force, and I'm gonna go back home to South Carolina, and I'm gonna run for Congress. And sure enough, that's exactly what he did. So I joined the Air Force thinking I was gonna go do 4 years, I'd get some trial experience, and then I would come back to North Carolina. And one thing just led to another. I kept getting, I wish I could, when I used to talk to younger JAGs, I would tell them, I wish I could tell them how I planned my career, but there's no real planning to it. It was just opportunities that came along that I thought, this sounds interesting, I'll go do that, and then I'll go home. And then the next job sounded interesting, and then the next thing you know, you're over the 10-year point, and you're on the downhill side, so I ended up staying for 25 years. I would imagine, obviously, you heard about me, or you wouldn't be here, and I guess what most people hear about is when I was a Chief Prosecutor for the military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. So I'll come back to that in a minute and talk about it in a little more detail. But anyway, I've been a member of the North Carolina Bar. This will be 37 years that I've been a member in good standing with the North Carolina Bar. I'm a lifelong Democrat. One of the things I'm going to have framed, my dad, it was his invitation to JFK's inauguration. So, we've been lifelong Democrats. I voted in every presidential election. That's one of the things I like to do tonight. A couple of my opponents, I think, are taking the Republican tactic of rather than talking about their records, they're trying to distort mine. I'm a lifelong Democrat. My first election was in 1976 when I got to vote for Jimmy Carter. The last one is 2016 when I got to vote for Hillary Clinton. And I voted in every presidential election in between. I think I voted most all of the other major elections. I may have missed some bond referendums and some other things of that nature, but I definitely voted in all the presidential elections and the big ones. I know one of my opponents was saying they couldn't find any record of my voting. In the military, I left North Carolina, went to Florida. And then from Florida, we went to Texas, Texas to Virginia, Virginia back to here. So I can assure you I've registered in the states where, in those states, and I voted in those states in the election. There's another issue was raised. There's no proof I live in Asheville. If you go out in the parking lot, you'll see my North Carolina tag on the car. I've got a North Carolina driver's license. We bought property here in 2018, so we paid property tax in Asheville for the last 2 years. We're currently living in Chuns Cove. We're renting a house, we're building, and our house is supposed to be ready in April, but it probably means June or July. But it's, I plan to stay here till they toe tag me. So Asheville is home. It has been for a while, and it's going to continue to be. As I said, I joined the military in 1983. It stayed until I retired officially October 1st of 2008. I was a colonel when I retired. Again, I guess I'm best known for my time as Chief Prosecutor at Guantanamo. If I could back up just a bit, though, if you recall, November of 2001, President Bush signed an order that authorized military commissions at Guantanamo. The first detainees, in fact, next week will be the 18th anniversary of the first detainees arriving at Guantanamo Bay. It was later in 2002 is when there was the first real big push to actually start up the military commissions. So in all of the services in the JAG Corps, message went out looking for volunteers, because there were literally dozens and dozens of attorney positions that had to be filled. Judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, there were a bunch of administrative processes as well. So there's a big call for attorneys to volunteer for these positions. At the time, I was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama. I was the deputy commandant of the Air Force JAG School. And I volunteered. I volunteered to be the chief defense counsel for the detainees. The reason I did that was, if you think back to the Boston Massacre, John Adams volunteered to represent the British soldiers that were accused in the Boston Massacre. If you think back to that period as well, America was still really mad about 9/11, so I wasn't sure that anybody really would want the job of defending the detainees. And I thought it was important that somebody do it and do it right. If you look back, if you remember the trial of the Nazi saboteurs, the 8 saboteurs, they were represented by Colonel Durham from North Carolina, who was an Army colonel who fought all the way to the Supreme Court for the Nazi saboteurs. So it was kind of with that same attitude. I thought it was important that somebody step up and do it right in a way that we can feel good about. I didn't get the job. A friend of mine, a guy named Will Gunn, who's an Air Force Academy grad, Harvard Law School, White House fellow, got the job. And it's kind of hard to argue, with that choice. So after that, I kind of it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. I stayed at the JAG School as a deputy commandant, moved on to a couple of other jobs. Then in February of 2005, Lisa is in the back there as my wife, and my daughter and I, she's in pink. I think I'm acutely colorblind. I think.
Hi, Lisa.
So we'd moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I was the senior attorney for 20th Air Force. That's the command that controls all the intercontinental ballistic missiles. So we got there in February of 2005, and in July I got a call from the Judge Advocate General of the Air Force asking if I would consider being the Chief Prosecutor. So we flew out here in July, flew to D.C. in 2005. I had an interview with the DoD General Counsel, a guy named Jim Haynes. You may know him. If you recall the Rumsfeld memo, the torture memo, Jim Haynes wrote that memo. That's who I interviewed with for the job as Chief Prosecutor. I remember during the interview, he said, this trial is going to be the Nuremberg of our times. And this can make you the most famous attorney in America. And I remember thinking that shows a lot about what he knows about military law, that he thinks somebody wants his job to be famous. My thinking was still like it had been as being the Chief Defense Counsel. I thought it was important that somebody do it and do it right. The reason I'd gotten a call from the Judge Advocate General about taking the job, you may remember the first Chief Prosecutor, there were some of the members of the prosecution team that thought they were being leaned on to do things they didn't think were ethical. And there were some email exchanges between them and the Chief Prosecutor that ended up in the New York Times, which led to the first Chief Prosecutor being relieved of duty. Those young JAGs that had circulated the emails were Air Force attorneys. So the Judge Advocate General said, the Air Force helped create this problem. We need to help fix it. So would you consider taking the job? So at the interview, I remember telling Jim Haynes, they brought up Nuremberg. I said, at Nuremberg, some of the people were convicted and executed and some were acquitted. And I remember he kind of rocked back in his chair and said, because I'd said, if we have some acquittals in the military commissions, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. It would tend to show the legitimacy of the system. And he kind of rocked back and he said, acquittals? We can't have acquittals. We've been holding these guys and telling everybody that they're the worst of the worst. And we've got to have convictions. So I was approved for the job. We moved to the D.C. area in September, and that's when I became the Chief Prosecutor. The people that had been on the prosecution team in the first meeting that I had with them, they were concerned because the first guy they felt had pressured them to do things they didn't think fell within the ethical bounds that they could live with. So at the first meeting, I told them that we weren't going to use any evidence obtained by torture. Or back then, I couldn't use the term torture. It was called enhanced interrogation techniques. But I said, we're not going to use that evidence because people my age, and probably some of you are about the same age, we looked at Nuremberg with kind of a sense of reverence. That when the war ended, we didn't take the Nazis out and shoot them. We had trials. And some were convicted and executed, and others were acquitted and released. And I said, I want us to do this in a way that when our grandkids look back at Guantanamo, they'll think of it the way we thought of Nuremberg. That in tough times we did the right thing and lived up to our principles. And you can kind of see that sigh of relief on the part of the members of the prosecution team. So for 2 years, the people above me in the chain of command were all career military people. They all agreed with that policy. And to be quite honest with you, the evidence that was obtained through the enhanced interrogation techniques were not particularly useful. One of the first big things I was involved with was at that time, the high-value detainees, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other guys, were still in the CIA black sites. The CIA felt they'd gotten all the information they could get, and they didn't think they were in the business of running an offshore prison, so they wanted to get rid of them. And so the big issue for my first almost a year was meetings with the National Security Council, members of the Bush administration, on whether they would go to Federal Bureau of Prisons and Department of Justice to be tried in federal court or to Guantanamo and through the military commissions. And ultimately in the spring of 2006 is when President Bush decided to go the military commission route. So in September of 2006 is when the plane landed at Guantanamo and 14 people got off the airplane, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. We didn't know how many people. There were more than 14 detainees that were held in the black sites. We didn't know how many would come to Guantanamo, but eventually 14 did. If you think about it, of those 14 men that got off the plane in September of 2006, there's only one that's been tried, convicted, sentenced to life. His case has been all the way to the Supreme Court. It is over and done. And that was Ahmed Gilani. He was the only detainee that's ever brought to the U.S. and tried in federal court, where he was convicted, got a life sentence, and his case is over and done. The other 13 people that got off the airplane that day are still at Guantanamo and still waiting for their day in court. Yeah, there's one of the ironies that I resigned over 12 years ago, and not much has happened in 12 years other than people have gotten older. So when I took the job, that was the policy. I had a lot of support above me not to use evidence obtained by torture. About the time the decision was made for the high-value detainees to be transferred to Guantanamo, the Supreme Court came out with a decision called Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. And that was the decision where the court said the president didn't have the authority, the unilateral authority to create military commissions. It required Congress intervening. So I got a phone call from Captain Lindsey Graham asking if I would come over and meet with he and John McCain because they were the architects of the Military Commissions Act. I think one thing that's unique about me compared to the other candidates is I actually wrote, I can take you to the statutes and show language where I've actually written congressional language that was included in the Military Commissions Act. During the debate, there's a quote in the congressional record, there's no finer officer in the military than Colonel Moe Davis. So I worked with John McCain and Lindsey Graham on the Military Commissions Act. During that meeting, when I brought up that I was not going to use evidence obtained by torture, John McCain was standing behind me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm so glad to hear you say that. Now what do you need to get the job done right?" So we went about the Military Commissions Act. You recall President Bush had a Rose Garden ceremony where he announced the high-value detainees had gone to Guantanamo, signed the Military Commissions Act. It was January of 2007 before Secretary Gates signed the implementing orders for the military commissions. And in February, I personally charged Salim Hamdan, Omar Khadr, the Canadian teenager, and David Hicks, who was an Australian. Eventually, David Hicks pled guilty. To my surprise, Dick Cheney had made a trip to Australia. John Howard was running for re-election. David Hicks had become a celebrity in Australia, and it was hurting John Howard's re-election effort. And so he and Dick Cheney worked out a deal where David Hicks pled guilty and was sent back to Australia and stayed in custody there just past the election when he was released from custody, and John Howard ended up losing the election. That summer of 2007, several of the people above me in the chain of command retired, and they were replaced by political appointees. The head of the military commissions was a lady named Susan Crawford. Ms. Crawford had been the Inspector General for Dick Cheney when Dick Cheney was the Defense Secretary. So Ms. Crawford was appointed as the head of the military commissions, yet she never served a day in uniform in the military. A new legal advisor, Ms. Crawford, came in, and in July of 2007, he and I were on a trip to his first trip down to Guantanamo. I escorted him. We had to fly into Fort Lauderdale to catch an FBI flight to go down there. And I remember the date. It was the day the bridge in Minneapolis collapsed, because that was while we were there. And that was the first time at dinner that night he kind of jokingly brought up that, President Bush said we don't torture, so who are you to say that we do? And over time, that kind of joking reference became if President Bush said we don't torture, who are you to say that we do? And so that was when I was ordered that evidence that we were not going to use, so we had to get it out, dust it off, get these guys into court, and get them convicted. So I first went through the chain of command, through the Inspector General, to try to resolve this. Part of the language that was included in the Military Commissions Act that I wrote said that no one could put pressure on the prosecution in the exercise of their professional judgment. And now I'm being told I got to use evidence obtained by torture. So in October, I got a written order from the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Gordon England, saying that I reported to the general that they told me I had to use the torture evidence, and that general reported directly to Jim Haynes, who had written the torture memo. So that was when I went back to my office and drafted up an email to Secretary England saying I could no longer perform the duties of Chief Prosecutor. So I moved over from my last year, I was the Director of the Air Force Judiciary, where I had oversight for the criminal justice system in the Air Force, and about 265 attorneys and paralegals around the world that worked for me implementing the military justice system. So, one of the things that was said about me is that, I resigned in disgrace, I didn't get a medal when I left. That's not true. I was promoted to, I went from supervising 110 people at the military commissions to 265 people in the judiciary. If you looked on the website, there's a picture of me with the 3-star General Jack Rise, who's now the Executive Director of the American Bar Association, where he's pinning a Legion of Merit on me for my service. So some of those rumors that you're hearing out there aren't true. So after I left, I retired officially October 1st of 2008. I remember it was July 31st of 2008. I had checked into Walter Reed. I had a sleep study done at Walter Reed. The next morning, on July 31st, I got up and put my coat, my suit on at Walter Reed and went down to the Capitol where I testified in a hearing in the Armed Services Committee about torture in Guantanamo and why it should be closed. Sitting next to me was Neil Katyal, who was Hamdan's attorney. So while I was in that meeting, when I came out, I turned my phone on. I had a message from the director of the Congressional Research Service calling to offer me a job as the head of the Foreign Affairs Defense and Trade Division. So I started that job in December of 2008, and it was a great job. I had about 100 people that worked for me that were PhDs in some of the most esoteric areas that you can imagine, dealing with foreign affairs, defense, and trade. And I was a senior specialist in national security, was my official title. Yeah.
And you just said national security, and I apologize for breaking in, but Norm's just pointed out to me that apparently there's an air base in Iraq that's housing American troops that is under rocket attack from presumably Iraqi forces. So that's going on now. Anyway, that's sort of, I apologize, but in case folks didn't know that, it's apparently Al-Assad Air Base. So anyway, apparently there are, consequences.
Yeah. So again, I think my expertise in national security is something, certainly something I've been talking about, but it's become even more relevant in the last week or so because we have an irrational president who takes irresponsible actions. But I worked for Congressional Research Service from December 2008 to January of 2009. I'm sorry, December 2008 to January 2010. When you're in the military, you can't be involved in partisan politics. You're encouraged to vote and donate and do all those kind of things. But you can't actively, you can't run for office. You can't actively participate in political campaigns. So, as I said, I retired October 1st of 2008. So for the first time, I got to actively participate. So Lisa and I put up a Obama-Biden sign in our front yard. I volunteered with the Prince William County Obama Committee. We lived in a gated community, but one of our neighbors, we don't know who, doused our Obama sign in lighter fluid and burned it down. So we put up another one. And I don't think anybody was more excited to see Obama win than me.
I was.
If you recall back during that
We
time.
were pretty excited.
I'm excited too, because he and McCain, at one point, closing Guantanamo was a bipartisan issue. They both campaigned on closing Guantanamo. I've joked in retrospect, what Obama should have said is, I love Guantanamo, I'll keep it open forever, and Mitch McConnell would have shut it down by February.
Right.
But instead, it became whatever Obama's for were against, and so what was the first order Barack Obama signed? It was the Lilly Ledbetter Act. And the second order he signed was the order to close Guantanamo. And so I was pretty excited. I just gotten this new job. I just retired as a colonel. Obama's signed the order to close Guantanamo. Life was looking pretty good. By the fall, President Obama, they began to backpedal on closing Guantanamo. I don't think he expected the backlash that he got. And certainly at that point, the economy was crashing. Healthcare was a big priority. And so Guantanamo kind of became a back burner issue. So I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that was critical of the administration for backpedaling on Guantanamo. The same day, I had an opinion piece in the Washington Post that it compared Attorney General McCasey. I said, he was as big a liar as Dick Cheney. The next day, I got called in and fired from my job for writing the op-eds. So I spent the next 7 years in federal court fighting for the First Amendment right with the help of the ACLU. It's kind of ironic. The ACLU, I was not like high on their list of favorite people when I was the chief prosecutor. The day I got fired, Anthony Romero called me. He's the head of the ACLU. Anthony became the head of the ACLU on September the 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11. And like I said, I was not particularly high on their list of favorite people for a while, but the day I got fired, Anthony called and said, "What can we do to help?" And so the ACLU spent $1 million in 7 years fighting for me and the First Amendment rights of federal employees. And we eventually settled. They expunged my record, wrote me a check for $100,000, and the ACLU really stood up and fought hard for me. So after getting fired, it was kind of tough finding a job in Washington because I'd upset the administration, the Bush administration. I had spoken out against torture. So for a while there it was tough, but I got a job as the executive director of the Crimes of War Education Project, which is a group of journalists that had covered the war in Bosnia. And during that, they realized that if the world understood that there are rules that apply in war, maybe some of the atrocities could have been avoided. So it's people like Christiane Amanpour and Jess Braven from the Wall Street Journal and others that did little short articles that ordinary people could understand about the different aspects of the law of war. And so I was executive director there for a year. Then I moved over to Howard Law School, and I was a professor at Howard for 4 years, where I taught legal writing, appellate advocacy, and national security law. And after doing that, then I moved over to the Department of Labor, and that was what I was doing until September of this year. I was teleworking from here in Asheville, and I was a judge at the Department of Labor, where primarily I did black lung hearings for coal miners up in Southwest Virginia, Kentucky, West Virginia. Also whistleblower cases and immigration cases involving H-2A and H-2B work visas. So in 3 of those jobs, I had top secret SCI clearances. So I've been vetted pretty thoroughly if you've ever been through the security clearance process. I held a top secret clearance up through September when I left the Department of Labor, and I had to sign out of that job. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. I guess one of the arguments that I've been making on why I should be the person you vote for is when you look at my record, you don't have to look at, if you look at some people, you think, I wonder if he'll do the right thing in tough times. Well, I've been through Guantanamo, I've been through the First Amendment, I've been through those issues, and you can see for yourself what I did. So I think I've been tried and tested, and I passed the test when it comes to trust. So the issues, and again, I'm happy to talk about any issue you want to.
Well, the first thing is the progression of what you just said is, and what brought you to the decision to run? And what is it that you want to be bringing by running?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. When I grew up in North Carolina, and again, any native North Carolinians, I know a lot of people have moved. I grew up here, primarily in the 60s and 70s, and I was really proud to be a North Carolinian because we had good roads, we had good schools, we had Research Triangle Park before anybody ever heard the word Silicon Valley. And we were a proud progressive state. I think we kind of looked our nose down at some of the other South Carolina and some of the other states that we felt we were more progressive than they were. And it seems like I left, to serve in the military, and while I was gone, the GOP hijacked my state.
Good word.
Well, I think, to me, the North Carolina GOP is a criminal organization. They have done everything to, rob, cheat, steal, lie, whatever it takes to retain power. And they've tried to roll back the clock. So I remember growing up here, what a proud progressive state we were.
Jim Hunt.
Yeah, Jim Hunt was governor, Rufus Edmondson was the attorney general, Thad Urey was the secretary of state. It was really a time when North Carolina, I think, was kind of in its, firing on all 8 cylinders. And it seems like the Republican Party has spent the last decade trying to roll back the hands of time.
Jesse Helms.
Yeah, and John Eastman was the other senator. But I think we can get back to that. That we all rode together in the same direction. We can become that leader again that I remember from having grown up here. So just watching from afar what happened to the state was really disappointing. In fact, if you follow me on Twitter, I've been bashing Mark Meadows for a couple of years now. And so when I moved down here, remember in June the Supreme Court decision came out and said partisan gerrymandering is not a violation of the U.S. Constitution. So I'd written off any prospect of running, because where I live is in the clearly gerrymandered part. So my plan was I was retiring in September, and I was going to sit on the porch and drink beer and enjoy life. And then in November, when the court intervened and told the legislature, either you redraw the map or we're going to do it, it became clear that Asheville and Buncombe County was going to get reunited, because you can't articulate a non-laughable reason for that little carve-out other than rigging the process. So that's when I, again, thought there's an opportunity. In my view, I spent most of my adult life either in the military or in public service, because I believe in democracy. And so that's why I'm looking for a third opportunity to serve, because we need to get the ship back on the right course. And so that's where I felt like I needed to jump in and try to do my part to do that. So.
Your positions all seem to be right in line with progressives,
Right.
from what I can see. And that, in this district, which is bipolar, what plans do you have how to reach into those rural western counties to?
Yeah, and you're right. This is an interesting district, because in the Asheville proper area,
You gotta be left.
Yeah, you can't be far enough left, but you go 10 miles outside of Asheville, and you can't be far enough right. And so I don't want to run on something I don't believe in. So I don't want to make up, I support this or that just for purposes of winning the primary or winning the general election. So I've tried to call it, if you go on the website, we've tried to, we're late to the game, so we're a little, behind in getting up all the policy positions. But I've tried to take positions that I think are reasonable, that I believe in, and that I think hopefully can have some appeal. I guess I've kind of written off the people that won't accept facts you can't reason with. And so I've kind of given up on trying to persuade people that just deny facts. But I think they're like Reagan Republicans that are deeply offended by what's happened with the country. And I think some of them we can reach across the aisle and appeal to try to be reasonable. I think, if you remember during the last election, one of President Trump's arguments he made in the African-American community was, what have you got to lose by giving me a chance? I think in the western counties in particular, where the poverty rate's 20%. If you look at unemployment is like 3.5%, 4% in most of the western counties. The poverty rate's 16 to 20%. So what does that tell you? People are working, they're not earning a living. The uninsured rate in those counties is double the national average. The Citizen Times had an article here recently about education, that the kids in those western counties are in the bottom third of the country in math and science, and math and reading. So it's one of those things where in the time I've had to travel around, when you ask people, what can you point to that Mark Meadows has done in 4 terms that has made your life better? People really stumble trying to come up with an answer.
Right.
So I think we can reach across to some of those people and say, what have the Republicans done for you? And everybody that's running, the 12 Republicans that are running, have all said, we are proud Trump supporters. So you're going to get another Mark Meadows fill in that seat if you elect a Republican. So why not give a Democrat?
So they need health care, they need education, they need
jobs. Yeah, those are kind of the big 3, and I was going to try kind of tick off. On the jobs front, I'm a big believer, and it's one of those things too, like if you remember with Obamacare, people just kind of, the right, they repulsed when you said Obamacare, but when you started going down the list of what do you think about pre-existing conditions and your kids, they liked all the components. They didn't like
the ACA,
right.
as opposed to Obama.
Yeah, well, it's the same with the Green New Deal. If you say Green New Deal, a lot of people, oh, it's socialism. But then you start going down the list of components, and they like the components. So I'm a big believer in green technology and green jobs. We're doing solar and geothermal at our house. Those are good jobs, good, sustainable,
North
well-paying
Carolina
jobs.
has the highest adoption of solar after, I think it's
Yeah,
California.
we're number 2.
Yeah, so
And we're doing...
we should be touting that.
Exactly, yeah. And the solar panels we're putting on are made in America, but they're not made here. So why aren't they made here? Because we have people... My experience in North Carolina, I grew up, one summer I worked in a factory in Shelby. And I remember the guys there during our breaks, they put in a rule that summer, because the guys used to work double shifts. They do 80 hours a week. And for safety reasons, they put in a rule you could only do 2 doubles. And the guys there always complaining. They never complained they weren't getting enough pay. because they couldn't get enough hours. So they're hardworking people. And if we could get them the training and the opportunity, I think green jobs are a great way to, it's good for the environment, it's good for employment, it's good for national security, because if we can generate our own energy, we don't need foreign energy. And I think a lot of those people, those red voters, if you said, how would you feel about not having a power bill? They'd probably be pretty happy with that. Because if you look at what they're paying for a power bill, you could make the payments on a solar system. Now, you can't do solar at every house, but you can do a lot, and that power goes back into the system. So to me, it's just like a triple win going with green jobs.
A lot of places you can't do solar, you can do geothermal.
Right, and they're both, and that's one of the things
It's
I would.
expensive, but.
Oh, that's one of the things I would fight for in Congress. On January 1st, the federal credits got rolled back to 20. It was 30%, now it's 26. It goes down every year until eventually they're phased out. That 30% tax credit and the Duke Power Rebate Program, which is in its third year of a 5-year deal, made it affordable. To where if you put in a solar system, you could, like, I don't know the thing I saw, like over a 10-year period, it'll pay for itself. So I think a lot of those red voters, if you could show them that you could get, you could do away with your power bill by going green, and we could make those panels here and hire people here to install them, that would be good, sustainable jobs and do a lot of good things for the area. So I think green is the way to go on the jobs front. On healthcare, I'm a believer that healthcare is a fundamental right. Everybody in this country, if they get sick, ought to be able to go to the doctor. You got to be able to take your kid to get a flu shot. You shouldn't go bankrupt because you got sick or you got hurt. So I support having, everybody is a right, having basic health care coverage. I know a lot of the unions feel that they've negotiated good contracts that give their members better coverage. So I don't have any objection. If people want to have their own insurance, I think they ought to be able to do that, but I don't think they should get a credit for it. And I think the government should provide basic health care coverage for everyone. We're spending over $10,000 per person per year on health care, which is more than any country in the world. If you look at the countries that we consider kind of our peers, I think Canada's next at about $8,000 a year, but Sweden, England, Finland, Norway, a lot of the average is about $5,000 per year, and everybody is covered. We're spending double that, and we have 30 million people that aren't covered. Yes, sir.
I love all the positions you're saying, and this story is very inspiring. Here's a question. So I'm a psychologist. I work with kids and adults, but a lot of kids from Rutherford, Haywood, and Madison counties. And I see a lot of the red Trump supporters.
Right.
And my sense is with a lot of them, they aren't at all committed to Trump. They feel like because of what the GOP has done, it's tarnished all politics. They say, I don't care what you plan. We don't trust you. What we like about Trump is he's just bashing everybody.
Right.
And I feel like you're right. They could talk to him. I wonder, have you talked to, this is a very knowledgeable audience.
Right.
These are like really politically astute. Everyone's nodding their head. Yes, I think like in 2007, we all know that. Have you talked to those people? And do they say, yeah, you say this about jobs, tax credits, but you guys never do it? How do you talk to them?
Yeah, that's
Directly.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I know I'm preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of the appeal, I think, for Bernie Sanders and for Donald Trump, that I think people looked at them as somebody that was ready to Washington and break glass.
Right.
They're not beholden to the party. They're going to go there and they're going to raise hell and they're going to look out for people like them.
Right.
And I think I've got a record of doing it. I mean, I stood up to both administrations, so I've tried to call it like I see it and stand up for what I believe in. So I'm hoping I can persuade some of those people that that's my commitment to them. I'm not running to use this as a springboard for a higher office.
That's good.
When I'm done, I'm done. I am going to the house to put my feet up and drink a beer. I'm not, whenever I'm done, if I get elected and I'm representing this district, when I'm done, I'm done.
That's good.
I'm not taking any PAC money. Some of my opponents are taking PAC money. I'm taking individual donations. So I'm not, there's an article today, I think, I forget who it was, one of the former senators is now taking a lobbyist position representing big corporations and foreign governments. I'm not going to do that. So I'm not beholden to a special interest or a corporation. I'm not using this to run for another office. I seriously believe that our country, our state is seriously off course, and it's important to get us back on an even keel. So that's, I hope I can you know, some
I
of
wouldn't call them the red people.
yeah, I gotta come,
Yeah.
I think, well, you gotta give the right credit. They've done a really good job of persuading people that it's their patriotic duty to vote against their self-interest. And we've got to persuade them to look at, you know, face the facts, look at your situation. You don't have insurance, you're getting a bad education, you don't have job prospects, which leads to an opioid crisis, and it's just this vicious circle. So again, I think, you know, if we could get everybody to row together, and, you know, it's for the common good. Because we pitted each other against, you know, one group against another. We're all in this boat together. And if we could all row in one direction, there's some great things we could do for this state and this country. Yes.
I've been doing a lot of reading about the psychology of politics and persuasion and what forms of argument and rhetoric move people and what doesn't, what puts people off and what brings them in. And my takeaway from most of what I've been reading up on recently makes a very strong case for presenting, although the temptations are huge and the target is rich, spending all of one's time, or even a majority of one's time, bashing the current disaster that's our head of state is not what moves anybody. People have already made up their minds on the subject of Donald Trump and his entire enterprise.
And are invested.
And everyone is entrenched. Why was Barack Obama elected? People make fun of it, but he was elected because he was actually one of the few Democrats in our lifetimes, I'm the same age as you are, who ran on an unrelentingly positive vision of America. Yes, we can. Hope. We're all one, you know.
Right.
That message has been drowned out in the last 3 years period of time. And I think that those of us who were reeling at the last general election and have just been, you know, battered with one new low after another, the temptation is to just be about resistance. And that's not a message that's going to win over the large majority that we're going to need to combat a plus 6 Republican district,
Right.
which is what we're looking at right now. I urge you to frame your stump speeches in the most forward-looking, positive, optimistic, and non-combative terms possible.
Right.
You know, Michelle Obama said we go high when they go low, and you know, a lot of people have complained about Democrats not being aggressive enough. I don't think that's the problem. It's not lack of aggression, it's constantly keeping people alert to the possibilities of greatness, the true patriotism that can enliven our nation, which has been trampled in the dirt for 3 solid years. And if you can bring that, and I believe that you have the resume and the experience to speak truthfully out of that kind of integral position, that is what will move the folks who, you know, have, you know, they voted for Trump and now they're like embarrassed.
Right.
But if you can stand up and you can put forward a positive forward-looking message, that will work. That will.
If I can continue on
Sure.
that, and I am a psychologist. Exactly, the thing that the Democrats have missed for years, and Republicans understand very clearly, is that elections are about emotion.
Right.
Right.
And they have mastered the emotion of fear and anger. And the Democrats, one time, with Barack Obama, answered with a positive message, emotional message of hope, and won, and then he dropped it when he governed.